A millionaire hires a gardener to clean her house, and when she gets home, she finds him doing something that leaves her in shock. If you're new here, welcome. Hit subscribe and join thousands who never miss a story. Like this video so more people can find stories that remind them hope is always near. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been saved by someone you least expected? This is the story of a gardener, a grieving mother, and 4 hearts learning to bloom again. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just like any other, except it wasn't. Lucas Mercer almost didn't answer. He was elbow deep in soil, his weathered hands carefully separating the roots of a struggling rosebush at old Mrs. Patterson's place on Elm Drive, when his phone buzzed in his back pocket for the 3rd time. He wiped his hands on his jeans, squinted at the screen, and felt his stomach tighten in a way he could not quite explain. Hale Estate, private number. He had applied for the position 3 weeks ago on a whim. A long shot, he knew, and he had known it when he sent the application. The Hale property on the edge of Cedarwood Hills was the kind of place most people in town only ever saw from the road. 12 acres of manicured lawns, sculpted hedges, a rose garden that ran the full length of the eastern fence, and a wrought iron gate that always seemed slightly too serious for a home. The listing had asked for an experienced groundskeeper with impeccable references and a commitment to long-term care. Lucas had sent in his resume, a short handwritten cover letter, and 3 photographs of gardens he had transformed over the years. A sunken garden in disrepair that he had brought back to full life in 18 months, a walled courtyard that had been all weeds when he found it, and his own backyard on Briar Patch Lane. He had not expected to hear back. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, clearly an assistant. Ms. Hale would like to schedule a walkthrough this Thursday at 9. Are you available? He looked down at the rosebush. At his truck, parked crookedly at the curb with the side door that did not close all the way. At the small St. Christopher medal hanging from the rearview mirror. Sophie's gift pressed into his hand 3 Christmases ago when she was 4 years old, her face completely solemn. It will keep you safe on the road, she had told him, with the absolute authority of a child who has decided something is true. Yes, he said. I will be there. He stood in Mrs. Patterson's yard for a long moment after he hung up, looking at the rosebush in his hands, feeling the particular quality of a morning that has shifted without warning into something else entirely. Lucas had been a single father for 4 years. Sophie was 7 now, small for her age, enormous in everything else. She had her mother's eyes, dark and round and always a little too knowing for a face that young, and she had Lucas's particular stubbornness in the way she planted her feet when she had made up her mind about something. There was no moving Sophie Mercer once Sophie Mercer had decided. He had learned early to choose his battles and to admire the ones he lost. She loved drawing horses in the margins of everything she could find. Homework, paper bags, the backs of his work invoices. She made up songs in the bathtub with complete unself-consciousness. Elaborate compositions that went on for 15 minutes and were entirely her own. She reorganized Lucas's toolbox by color every few weeks, which drove him moderately crazy, until the day he had stood in the garage looking at the neat rainbow rows and understood, with a clarity that startled him, that watching her organize things was one of the purest pleasures in his life. He had never found a way to say that to her without making it strange for both of them. He just let her keep doing it. Her mother, Dana, had left when Sophie was 3. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly, the way a tide goes out, and one morning Lucas had woken up to a note on the kitchen table and a space beside him that was cold and final. Dana had wanted something he could not name and probably could not give. Something that had nothing to do with anything he had failed at specifically, and he had come to understand that, eventually. It did not make the weight of it lift. Some things you carry not because you have to, but because they are yours now, and there is no place to put them down. He and Sophie had built a life on Briar Patch Lane, in the small 2-bedroom house with the sloping front porch and the furnace that made a sound like a large animal sighing every time it cycled on. The yard was modest by any measure, but it was the most beautiful yard on the block, and every neighbor within 4 houses knew it. Lucas had climbing roses up the left fence. He had a kitchen herb garden beside the back steps, laid out in careful rows, labeled with the stakes Sophie had painted when she was 5 years old. Basil, thyme, mint, rosemary, spelled almost right. The letters large and confident. In the center of the lawn, he had planted a cherry tree 11 years ago. The spring he moved in, and it bloomed every April in a profusion of white that made people stop their cars on Briarpatch Lane just to look. He was good at making things grow. He always had been. It was the one thing in his life he had never doubted, not for a single morning in 34 years. There was a thing people never understood about working with plants, and Lucas had mostly stopped trying to explain it. It was not peaceful exactly, not the passive sort of peace people imagined when they pictured a man kneeling in a garden. It was more like meditation under pressure, a sustained attention that asked everything of you the way real listening does. You had to be completely present, set down the noise of your own life, and become, for those hours, entirely a receiver. Lucas had discovered this at 19, working summers for his uncle's landscaping company in Vermont, and he had never found anything else that produced quite the same quality of quiet in his head. He had tried explaining it to a woman he dated briefly years ago, and watched her expression move from interested to politely confused, and he had understood that some things you simply kept for yourself. The Thursday walkthrough was scheduled for 9. Lucas arrived at the Hale gate at 8:52, announced himself through the intercom, and waited while the iron panels swung open slowly, the way gates do when they are not used to hurrying. The morning held that particular October quality he loved, a transparency in the air, as if the world had been washed clean overnight and set out to dry in pale light. The smell of wet earth and fallen leaves rode on a northwest wind, and as he drove up through the corridor of old oaks, their branches interlocking overhead like the ribbing of a cathedral nave, he had the strange and particular sensation of entering a story that had already been going on for some time before he arrived. The property was extraordinary up close. The lawn on either side of the drive was maintained, but Lucas's trained eye caught what a casual visitor would not have seen. The rose beds along the east fence were overgrown, the deadheading neglected for at least 2 full growing seasons. The boxwood hedges near the fountain had drifted out of true on the southern face, a year's growth unattended. The kitchen garden near the back terrace had been abandoned altogether, its raised beds dry and cracked, the soil gone pale with thirst. Someone had stopped caring for this place, not from the evidence of a bad groundskeeper, but from something more particular. These were the signs of a garden that had been loved and then left. Not neglected out of indifference. Left. The way you leave something when you no longer have the heart to stay near it. He knew that pattern. He had seen it before. He parked in the gravel beside the front steps, and the woman who opened the door was not the assistant he had expected. Victoria Hale. He had looked her up the way you look someone up before a job interview. She was the founder and CEO of the Hale Group, a commercial real estate development firm whose name was on buildings throughout 3 counties. The professional photographs on the company website showed someone sharp-featured and composed, the kind of face that had learned over time to give nothing away. In person, at the door of her own home at 9 on a Thursday morning, she looked younger than the photographs and more tired, and there was something in the way she held herself, precisely upright, careful, each movement deliberate, that reminded Lucas of someone navigating a room they were not entirely sure was solid underfoot. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming." He shook her hand and followed her through the grounds, and she walked slightly ahead of him the whole time, pointing out what she wanted addressed. The east beds, the hedges, drainage along the north fence, the terrace garden. She spoke without elaboration, practically, and he listened and looked and asked a handful of quiet questions. He noticed she never mentioned the history of the place, who had tended it before, what had happened to it. He did not ask. They were standing near the back terrace, the last stop on the tour, when he heard it. A faint sound from somewhere inside the house. Not words, more like a single piano note, struck once and held, and then the sustain fading slowly into nothing. Then silence. Victoria's posture shifted, nearly imperceptible, just a drawing in at the shoulders, a fractional stiffening. But Lucas had spent years reading the subtle messages that living things sent when something was wrong, and he had become very good at noticing small things. "When can you start?" she asked. He looked at the kitchen garden. At the abandoned beds, the dead weeds, the soil that had given up on itself. At the rose beds and their 2 years of untended grief written plainly in every overgrown cane. "Monday," he said. She nodded once with finality, and led him back to the front of the house without another word. He drove back down the oak corridor and through the iron gate, and he did not examine too carefully what he had felt standing on that terrace, listening to that single note fade into silence. He just noted it. The way he noted everything, carefully without judgment, and filed it somewhere he could find it later. In the upstairs window of the house, behind the white linen curtain, 2 small, identical faces watched his truck disappear down the road. They did not move. They did not make a sound. But they watched until he was completely gone. Lucas started on the rose beds that first Monday, and the estate woke up slowly around him. He arrived at 7:30, well before the household stirred, and let himself through the side gate with the key Victoria's assistant had left in an envelope at the main gate on Friday. The morning was cold and very still. The sky a uniform pale gray, and the estate in that early light had the quality of a place between states, not sleeping, not fully awake. He liked it that way. Some of his best work happened in the hours before anyone was watching. He had brought everything he needed, his 11-year-old bypass pruners. Their handles worn smooth in the exact shape of his grip, a pair of heavy leather gloves, a folding kneeling pad, a canvas tote for cuttings and debris. He had also brought a thermos of black coffee that Sophie had pressed into his hands at the door that morning, still in her pajamas with her spectacular morning hair, with the gravity of a physician handing over something critical. "Don't forget to drink it while it's hot, Dad." He had kissed the top of her head and promised. He crouched at the first rose bed and began to read the evidence. There is a kind of conversation that happens when you come to a neglected plant. A long, slow conversation that has been going on without you, and that you can join only if you are quiet enough and patient enough to follow it at the plant's pace rather than your own. Lucas had been having this conversation his whole working life. He could look at a rose bush that had gone 3 seasons without proper care and understand, from the pattern of its scars and its compensations, most of the story of its recent years. This bed had been loved once. Loved carefully. He could see that from the original architecture of the canes, the considered choices someone had made long before the neglect began. Whoever had tended these roses had known exactly what they were doing. And then they had stopped. He worked for 2 uninterrupted hours, moving down the bed with the slow, deliberate attention the work required. He was packing his tools to move to the south hedge when he first saw the twins properly. They appeared at the corner of the back terrace like something that had been there for a while before he noticed. 2 girls, exactly alike, standing with their shoulders just touching, watching him with the kind of steady, focused attention that children usually only bring to things they are genuinely trying to understand. They were small and slight, both wearing dark-colored sweaters, and they had their mother's eyes. Dark, direct, giving away nothing. But it was the quality of their stillness that arrested him. Lucas had a particular sensitivity to stillness, born from years of working in gardens. Living things are never completely still. They move with wind, with growth, with the subtle adjustments of living matter responding to the world. But these girls were still in a different way. Still the way something is still when it has learned to be, when stillness has become a protective measure rather than a natural state. He raised one hand. "Morning," he said simply. They did not answer. They did not look away. He turned back to his tools and kept working. He did not push. He had never pushed. Not in his whole life. His mother had told him once when he was 10 and frustrated with a tomato plant that would not cooperate, that the most important thing in any garden was patience, not the passive kind, not waiting without doing anything, but the active kind. The patience that keeps showing up and keeps paying attention, and trusts that the right conditions will eventually produce the right result. He had never forgotten it, and he had found over the years that it applied to a great many things beyond gardening. He packed his tools and walked to the hedge. He did not look back at the terrace, but he heard, just before he reached the hedge, the sound of 2 sets of small feet retreating across the stone terrace, quick, quiet, purposeful, and he allowed himself one private, careful moment of something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood. He put it away and went to work. Victoria, meanwhile, had stood at the kitchen window for longer than she intended. She had a full day ahead. Calls, meetings, a property assessment due to her senior partners. She had planned to leave by 7:45. At 8:30, she was still at the window with cold coffee in her hands, watching Lucas Mercer move through the east beds with an attention to the roses that she had not seen anyone give them in 14 months. James had planted those roses. Not all of them. Some had been there when they bought the property, established plants with 20 years of history in their root systems. But the newer ones in the center section, the climbers that were now struggling through their second year of neglect, James had planted those the first spring after the twins were born, working in the beds all one long Saturday while Victoria sat on the back terrace with Emma and Ellie strapped to her chest in the double carrier, both of them sleeping with the boneless completeness of newborns. And James had worked in the dirt and talked to the plants in a low, cheerful, constant commentary that she had fallen half asleep listening to, the warm weight of both daughters against her chest, the sound of her husband's voice rolling across the garden like water. She had not gone near those beds since the accident. She had not been able to. She had told the previous groundskeeping service to leave them alone, and they had. And she had watched from this window all through the spring and summer as the beds went wild, as the canes grew long and unpruned and the whole east section became a quiet testament to the absence of someone who had known exactly how to care for them. And then she had put it on Lucas Mercer's list. She had stood in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night going over the walkthrough notes, and she had written the east rose beds and underlined them twice, and she had not examined why. She had just done it, the way you sometimes do things that your heart has decided on before your mind has caught up. She thought about grief a lot in those days, not abstractly, philosophically, but practically the way you think about a chronic injury. What can I do today? What do I have to protect? What are the limits I have to work around? Grief was not, she had learned, the screaming devastation of the first weeks. Grief in the long run was subtler and in some ways harder. It was the way a room could be fine until it suddenly wasn't. It was the way a particular smell could take the floor out from under you. James had been the sound in this house, and now the house was full of the shape his sound had left. The outline of it, precise and permanent and everywhere she turned. The girls were on the terrace. She hadn't heard them go out. They moved so quietly now. Both of them, since James had been gone. The noise had gone out of them like air from a balloon, slowly, invisibly, until one day Victoria had looked up and realized that the house was silent in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. She watched Emma and Ellie at the terrace railing, watching the man in the rose beds, and she thought, James would have liked him. Not for any reason she could specifically name. Just a quality she recognized, something in the way Lucas moved through the garden without hurry or self-consciousness. The way he seemed, from this distance, to be entirely at home in the work. James had been that way about everything he loved. Her phone rang and she put down the coffee and went to be the person she needed to be at 8:30 on a Monday morning. The weeks that followed found their shape. Lucas came 3 mornings a week. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, arriving at 7:30 and working until noon. He left a handwritten note on the back terrace table each time he left, a brief record of what he had done and what he planned for next time. Victoria had suggested he send updates by email, and he had said without apology that he preferred paper for working notes. She had let it go. There was something she had found that she liked about the notes. Their plainness, their practicality, the way they asked nothing of her except to read them. The estate responded to his attention the way a neglected living thing responds to being cared for. Slowly, visibly, with something that looked almost like relief. The rose beds cleared themselves back into shape under his hands, the deadheading done cane by cane with a precision that was almost formal. The south hedge recovered its true line. The fountain basin was scrubbed and its stonework repointed. The kitchen garden beds were turned and composted and allowed to rest through the coming winter. What he had not expected, what he would not have been able to predict, was how much the estate would begin to feel like his own. Not ownership, not possession. Something softer, a quality of belonging that had nothing to do with legal title and everything to do with care. He knew where the drainage slowed on rainy mornings. He knew which rose bush was the strongest and which was the one he would have to watch closely all winter long. One evening in late October, Victoria read his terrace note and found, between the line about the fountain and the line about the north fence grating, a single additional sentence. Some things cannot be rushed, but spring always comes. She stood at the back door in her bathrobe reading it for a long time before she went to bed. She read it twice, then a third time slowly, like someone memorizing a prayer. By Halloween, both girls were sitting on the bottom step of the back terrace every Monday morning. December settled over Cedarwood Hills the way it always did, with a kind of definitive cold that made clear the season meant business. Lucas winterized the estate in the first 2 weeks. Mulch and burlap for the rose beds, protective wrapping for the vulnerable hedges. The fountain drained and covered with a fitted canvas tarp he had made himself from a pattern he had used at 3 other estates over the years. He planted 50 crocus and tulip bulbs along the front drive. He had not put it on the original work list. He had just brought them one morning, a flat of purple crocus and white tulip bulbs from the nursery on Route 9, and left a note on the terrace table saying, "Front drive bulbs for spring if you'd like." Planted on the south-facing side for early color. Victoria's reply left the following morning in the same spot. "Yes. Whatever you think is right. Whatever you think is right." He had stood reading those 5 words for a moment longer than necessary. The notes between them had accumulated into something he had not anticipated. A particular form of communication that was, in its precise brevity, oddly intimate. Not personal, not warm in any conventional sense, but careful, attentive. Each one slightly more considered than the last on both sides. She had written, "I noticed you have been doing the east beds by hand rather than with the shears. You don't have to, but I wanted you to know I see it." He had written back, "The east beds have good bones. They deserve the extra care." A pause of 3 days and then, "They were my husband's. The center section." That was all. Just that. He read it standing in the gray November morning, and he did not say anything about it in his reply. But he understood that something had been offered, and he received it quietly. "The way you receive something fragile," he wrote. "I can tell. They were well chosen and well placed." He knew what he was doing. "He did," she wrote back. The next time. Lucas Mercer was a man who had learned to be precise with what he allowed himself to feel. Not from coldness, not from damage, but from the long practical education of being a single parent. You could not afford to be swept away by things when someone depended on your staying level. So he had learned to note his feelings the way he noted a change in the weather, observantly, with interest, without letting it alter the course of what he was doing. He noted, therefore, carefully and without drama, that he had begun to think about Victoria Hale at times when there was no reason to, not with any particular longing, not in any way that made him feel he needed to manage it, just present. A quality of thought that turned toward her the way a plant turns toward the light, not urgently but consistently, without quite meaning to. He put it away every time, gently, precisely. He told Sophie none of this. He told Sophie about the twins, about their gradual advance across the terrace, about the Monday mornings when he looked up, and they were sitting on the bottom step close together, watching him work with those serious eyes. Sophie listened with intense interest. She said, "Do you think they're lonely?" He thought about it. "I think they're sad," he said, "which is different from lonely." She considered this carefully, the way she considered everything. How? He looked for the right words. Lonely is when there's no one there. Sad is when someone was there and now they're not. A long pause while she processed this. Then, "That's worse, isn't it?" "Yes," he said. "I think it is. But it's also different. Because you had something real. You know what it felt like. And that doesn't go away, even when the person does." Sophie went quiet in the way she went quiet when she was thinking seriously. Then she said, "Do you think they know their dad still loves them?" Lucas looked at his daughter. She was 7 years old, and she asked questions like that directly, without self-consciousness, the way only children and very old people can. "I think they do," he said. "But I think it helps to be reminded." He had been thinking about what it meant to be truly present for children who were not yours. Not in any complicated sense. Just the practical, honest question of what the right kind of attention looked like for two girls he barely knew who were carrying something enormous. He had Sophie, who was his entirely, whose needs he understood in the cellular way you know the needs of someone you have been responsible for since before they could speak. Emma and Ellie were different. They were a question he did not know how to answer yet, and he was wary of pretending otherwise. He had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do for something fragile was to approach it with false confidence. The first snow came on a Sunday in late November while Lucas was home. He and Sophie stood at the back door together, watching it come down in the fat, unhurried way of a first snow that intends to last, and Sophie said it looked like the world was being tucked in for the night. Lucas thought about the bulbs in the front drive of the Hale estate, and about James's rose beds under their burlap, and about two small girls sitting on a bottom step watching him work. And he felt something he could not precisely name, a tenderness for things that were dormant but not dead, things that were waiting for the right season to come back to themselves. December deepened. He found reasons to come to the estate even when the calendar did not require it, things to check, adjustments to make in the protective coverings when the wind picked up. Once, on a Saturday morning, he brought Sophie. He had cleared it first with Victoria's assistant. Sophie had walked the grounds beside him in near silence for 10 full minutes, processing everything with those serious eyes, and then said, "Dad, these roses are going to be something in June." He had squeezed her shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The twins were in the upstairs window when they arrived. Lucas saw them and gave his usual single-handed wave. Sophie, following his eyes, raised both arms in a wave so complete and unself-conscious it made Lucas want to laugh out loud. There was a pause behind the glass, and then, barely visible, provisional, the careful gesture of someone trying something they were not entirely sure about. One small hand lifted slightly in the window. Not a wave. Not yet. But the beginning of the consideration of one. Sophie turned back to the garden as if it were nothing, which was, Lucas suspected, exactly the right response. It was the third week of December, on a Wednesday morning 4 days before Christmas, that he heard the piano. He was at the back terrace loading the last of his tools, nearly noon, the morning's work done. A final check of the rosebed burlap after the previous night's wind. He heard the sound from somewhere inside the house, slightly clearer than usual, as if a window on the upper floor had been left open a crack. He stood still without quite deciding to. The notes came slowly, carefully placed with long pauses between them. He recognized the melody after a moment, a simple tune, something between a children's song and a Christmas carol, familiar in the indistinct way things are familiar from childhood. The playing was not skilled. It was something else entirely. It was deliberate. The way you are deliberate about something that costs you something. The way you put your foot down carefully on ground you are not sure will hold. The melody reached its end. Stopped. Started again from the first note. Got 3 bars further. Stopped again. Lucas stood on the terrace, in the cold December air, and listened to someone trying to find their way back to something they had put down 14 months ago. He did not move. He did not look toward the window. He just let it be there, let it have its space, the way you give space to something fragile that is trying to become whole again. When he finally moved, he set down his bag and took out his notepad and wrote, standing at the terrace table, "I heard the piano today. It was beautiful. See you in the new year. See you in." He walked back to his truck through the cold and touched the St. Christopher medal without quite knowing why. Just the way your hand finds something familiar when the rest of you is doing something it has not done before. He did not know that upstairs, Emma Hale had sat down at the piano bench for the first time since her father had lifted her onto it, and played with both small hands, every note chosen like it was the most important note in the world. And he did not know that Victoria had stood in the hallway outside the music room door, her back flat against the wall, listening to her daughter play, listening to the stopped and started melody that James had taught Emma the summer before he died, and crying in a way she had not cried since the days right after the accident. But this time, underneath the grief, there was something else. Something small and new, barely there. The way the first green shows under the soil in March before anyone is looking. before anyone even knows to look. A beginning. The faintest possible edge of something opening. Neither she nor Lucas had a name for it yet. But the ground had been prepared, the bulbs were in the earth, and somewhere beneath the cold and the quiet, something was already, carefully, coming alive. January came in hard and white, the kind of cold that settles into the bones of a house and stays there. Lucas returned to the Hale estate on the second Monday of the new year. The first working day after the holiday stretch had finally released its hold on the calendar. The drive up through the oak corridor felt different in January. The trees stripped entirely now, their bare branches reaching up against a sky the color of old pewter, and the whole property open and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in October, when the leaves had still been holding on. Winter had a way of showing you what was really there. He had thought about the estate more than he should have over the Christmas break. Not obsessively. Not with the kind of ache that made a person restless. Just the way you think about something you have put your hands into deeply. The garden pulling at his attention the way an unfinished conversation does. A low persistent awareness at the edge of his days. He had spent Christmas at his sister Maureen's place in Burlington, he and Sophie making the 3-hour drive on Christmas Eve with Sophie navigating from the passenger seat, using a road atlas she had found in the glove compartment, refusing to let him use the GPS. She was 7. She could not actually read a road atlas. This had not shaken her confidence in any way. Christmas with Maureen had been good, loud and warm, and slightly chaotic in the way all gatherings involving Maureen's 3 boys were. Sophie had held her own entirely, a small general among larger but less organized forces. And Lucas had sat in the kitchen with his sister on Christmas night. The kids finally asleep, and Maureen had looked at him over her coffee cup and said, "You seem different." He had said, "Do I?" And she had said, "Lighter. Like something is coming." He had not known what to say to that. So he had said nothing. And Maureen, who had known him his whole life, had nodded as if he had said something quite clear. He let himself through the side gate at 7:30 on that January Monday, and stood for a moment in the stillness of the winter garden, breathing the cold air, getting his bearings. The rose beds were holding. He walked the east beds first, checking the burlap, pressing the mulch back where the wind had shifted it along the northern edge. Everything he had put in place in December was doing its work. He made a note. He walked the front drive and found the first inch of crocus growth just visible above the soil. Barely there. Pale and provisional, but there. He crouched down and looked at it for a long moment. He did not leave a note about it. Some things you didn't need to write down. He was checking the south hedge when the back door opened, and Victoria came out onto the terrace. This was not unusual. She sometimes came out briefly in the mornings. Coffee in hand, a quick survey of the grounds before her day took over. But she stopped at the terrace railing and stayed there, watching him, in a way she didn't normally. He raised a hand in greeting, and she returned it, and then he went back to the hedge, and she stayed where she was. After a few minutes he heard her footsteps on the stone stairs. She stopped a few feet away. She was wearing a dark coat, her coffee mug in both hands, and she looked like someone who had prepared something to say and was now deciding whether to say it. He waited, without making a thing of the waiting. She said, "The girls asked about you. Over the break." He looked at her. "Emma wanted to know if the roses would still be there in the spring," she said. I told her yes. She said, "How do you know?" And I told her because the man who is taking care of them knows what he's doing. Lucas said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a good answer." Victoria looked down at her coffee. "It was the most I could give her," she said quietly. "She's been asking a lot of questions lately, both of them have. Ellie asked me last week what dead means. Not about their father. She knows what happened to their father. She meant the garden. She was looking out the window at the beds and she asked what dead means when it comes to plants." He turned this over carefully. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that in a garden, dead isn't always the end. I told her that some things that look dead are just waiting." She thought about that for a long time and then she said, "Okay," and went back upstairs. Lucas nodded slowly. "That's exactly right," he said. "For gardens." Victoria looked at him. "For gardens," she agreed. And then she went back inside and he watched her go. and he stood in the cold January air for a long moment before he picked up his tools and went back to work. Something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in soil temperature. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. The ground was moving toward something. He filed that thought away carefully, the way he filed everything, and he finished his morning and left his note and drove home through the winter-stripped hills of cedarwood. That evening, Sophie showed him a drawing she had made. 2 girls standing in a garden, surrounded by roses that were taller than they were. The girls in the drawing were holding hands. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "That's beautiful, Soph." She said, "I know they're sad, but I made the flowers really big so they'd feel safe." He kissed the top of her head and did not trust himself to say anything else. The following Wednesday, when he arrived at the estate, there was something different on the terrace table. Not his usual notepad space, but beside it, a small folded piece of paper with his name on it in handwriting, he recognized as belonging to neither Victoria nor her assistant. The letters were large and careful, the way a child writes when they are trying very hard. He opened it. It said, "Thank you for the roses. From Emma and Ellie." He stood at the terrace table with that piece of paper in his hands for a long time, the cold wind moving through the bare oak branches overhead, and he felt something open in his chest that he had not known was closed. He put the note in his shirt pocket over his heart and went to work. February arrived with a particular cruelty that year. 3 days of false warmth that coaxed the crocuses an inch further out of the ground, and then a hard freeze that came back and cracked the world like glass. Lucas drove to the estate at 5 in the morning when he got the weather alert. Before anyone had called him, before Victoria or her assistant had texted. He had checked the forecast the night before and done the math in his head, lying in the dark while Sophie slept across the hall, and he had known before he closed his eyes that he needed to be there at first light. He worked in the dark with a headlamp, carefully laying emergency frost cloth over the crocus beds, checking the burlap on the rose beds, tending to 2 of the hedge sections that had shown signs of cold stress the previous week. The temperature dropped further while he worked. He could see his breath in the lamplight. His hands ached in the cold. He kept working. The kitchen light came on at 6:15. He didn't look up immediately. But 10 minutes later, the back door opened, and Victoria came out with 2 mugs of coffee. She crossed the terrace and came down the steps, and walked across the frost-hard lawn to where he was crouched at the crocus bed. And she set one of the mugs beside him on the ground without saying anything. He sat back on his heels and picked it up. "Thank you," he said. She wrapped both hands around her own mug and looked at what he was doing. "You didn't have to come in the dark," she said. He looked at the beds. "I know," he said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you sleep?" "A little," he said. She nodded, like this confirmed something she had already suspected. She stood beside him in the cold and the dark for a few minutes, not speaking, both of them looking at the frost cloth laid over the crocus beds like a pale blanket. And there was something in the quality of that silence. The 2 of them standing together in the pre-dawn cold, not filling the air with words, that felt to Lucas like the most natural thing that had happened between them yet. Then Victoria said quietly, "James used to do this. Come out before a freeze. I used to wake up and he'd be gone and I'd look out and see his flashlight in the garden." Lucas didn't say anything. He just held the mug and listened. She said, "I haven't thought about that in a while. In a good way, I mean. Usually when something reminds me of him, She stopped, took a breath, Usually it feels like falling, but that one felt like remembering." He looked at her then, briefly, and she was looking at the beds, her profile very still in the pale early light. "There's a difference," he said. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said. "There is." They stood there a moment longer. Then she said she had calls starting at 7 and went back inside, and Lucas watched her go, and then turned back to the frost cloth and pressed the edges more firmly into the soil, and finished what he had come to do. He drove home in the early morning light with the heater running and Sophie's medal swinging from the mirror. and he let himself for the first time think something clearly that he had been keeping carefully at the edges of his thoughts for 3 months. He thought, I am in serious trouble here. And then he thought, with the calm precision that was his nature, all right, what do I do with that? The answer, he knew, was nothing precipitous. Nothing that would disturb what had been built so carefully. Whatever was happening, whatever this was, this thing that had grown up between them in the language of terrace notes and shared silences and pre-dawn coffee in the cold, it was fragile in the way that new things are fragile. It needed the same thing the rosebeds needed: patience, attention, time. He drove home. He made Sophie's breakfast. He drove her to school. He came back and he sat at the kitchen table on Briar Patch Lane, and he looked out at the cherry tree, bare and patient in the February cold, and he thought, spring comes. It always does. He was right. But he did not yet know what kind of spring it was going to be. The shift happened on a Saturday at the end of February, and it happened because of a pillow. Lucas had come to the estate to check on the frost recovery. The fall spring had relented, the temperatures had stabilized, and the crocus beds had survived without significant damage. He had let himself in through the side gate as usual, and he had done his rounds, and he was making notes at the terrace table when he realized he had left his good pruners in the potting shed near the back of the property. He walked back to retrieve them, and on his way he passed within sight of the rear living room windows, the long ones that looked out onto the back lawn, French doors that opened onto the terrace in summer. The curtains were partially open. He was not trying to look in. He was simply walking past. But the movement inside caught his peripheral vision and he stopped. And what he saw stopped him completely. Emma and Ellie were in the living room. They were in their pajamas, their dark hair loose, and they were in the middle of a pillow fight of extraordinary ambition, throwing cushions from the sofa at each other with the full commitment of children who have entirely forgotten that adults exist. But that was not what had stopped Lucas. Lucas had stopped because there was someone in the middle of it with them. His daughter. Sophie was there, in the living room, in her yellow weekend jacket, throwing a couch cushion at both twins simultaneously with a battle cry that Lucas could just barely hear through the glass. And Emma and Ellie who had not laughed in 14 months, Emma and Ellie who had stood in careful silence on the terrace for weeks and weeks, were laughing. Really laughing. Both of them. The kind of laughing that takes over the whole body, the kind you cannot perform, the kind that simply happens to you. Lucas stood outside the window with his hand on the pruners he had gone to collect, and he watched his daughter cause absolute beautiful chaos in that living room. And he watched those two small girls laugh like children who have remembered that they are children, and he felt something happen inside his chest that he did not have words for. Then the door at the far end of the room opened and Victoria walked in. She stopped. She stood in the doorway of her own living room, and she looked at her daughters, who had been silent and still and careful for 14 months, who had played no games and made no noise and retreated from every overture like small animals that had forgotten trust. She looked at them laughing in a storm of flying pillows, and Lucas watched her face from outside the glass. He watched her put her hand over her mouth. He watched her shoulders begin to shake. He watched Victoria Hale, CEO, widow, the woman who had learned to hold the shape of her life together through sheer disciplined force of will. He watched her slide down the doorframe until she was sitting on the floor with her back against it, both hands over her face, crying in a way that had nothing in it of falling. She was not falling, she was landing. Lucas stood outside in the February cold and did not move for a very long time. He was crying too, he realized. Somewhere in the last 30 seconds it had happened without him noticing. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the sky, which had gone the pale gold of late afternoon. And he breathed. Inside, Sophie had seen Victoria on the floor, and had crossed to her immediately, with the direct confidence of a child who knows what comfort is and does not overthink it. Lucas watched his daughter sit down on the floor beside a woman she barely knew, and simply put her small hand on the woman's arm, and stay there, saying nothing, just present. Emma and Ellie stood very still for a moment, and then they came to their mother too, both of them crossing the room in their quiet way and sitting down with her on the floor. one on each side until the four of them were there together in the low afternoon light. Lucas turned away then. It was not his to watch. He walked back to the potting shed and stood inside it for a while, in the smell of old soil and clay pots, his hand on the workbench, breathing. He had brought Sophie to the estate that morning to help him carry some equipment. Sophie, being Sophie, had done the carrying in about 11 minutes and had then apparently taken matters entirely into her own hands. He thought about saying something to her about it on the drive home, asking how it had happened, how she had ended up inside, what the girls had said. But when Sophie climbed into the truck beside him, her cheeks still flushed from the exertion of the pillow fight, she just buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window as he pulled away from the gate. After a minute she said, "They needed to laugh, Dad, so I made them laugh." He kept his eyes on the road. "How did you know how to do that?" She shrugged. "I just did what you do with things that are scared. I didn't make it a big deal, I just started and they joined in." He said nothing for a while. The road ran on ahead of them through the bare winter trees. Then he said, "Sophie." She looked at him. "You're something else," he said. She turned back to the window, but he saw the small satisfied smile at the corner of her mouth, and he drove home with it burning in his chest like a kept match, warm and steady, and entirely sufficient. He did not know as he drove that Victoria had watched his truck leave from the upstairs window with Emma on one side of her and Ellie on the other, all three of them looking down at the iron gate swinging closed. He did not know that Emma, without being asked, had slipped her hand into her mother's. He did not know that it was the first time in 14 months that either girl had done that. But the ground, as he had always known, was moving toward spring. March came, and with it the roses. Not the blooms. Those were still weeks away, the estate not yet in its full spring voice. But the signs were everywhere for someone who knew how to look. The tight red buds beginning to swell along the center canes of James's beds, the first true leaves uncurling along the climbers on the east fence, the front drive transformed by 50 crocus in purple and white that had survived the February freeze and opened in the thin March sunlight like a quiet announcement. Lucas walked the east beds on the first Monday of March and felt, with the particular certainty that comes from years of reading the language of growing things, that everything was going to be all right. Not perfect. Not without its scars, its losses, its canes that had not made it through the winter. But alive. Fully. Unmistakably alive. He was making his notes when he heard the French doors open behind him. He turned, expecting Victoria or her assistant. Instead, he found Emma and Ellie standing on the terrace in their coats, side by side, looking at him with the serious dark eyes he had come to know over these months. They were different now in ways both visible and not. The set of their shoulders less braced. The quality of their stillness changed from protective to simply observant. They looked, Lucas thought, like children who had remembered that the world was navigable. He raised his hand. "Morning," he said. "Morning," said Emma. It was the first time either of them had answered him. The word fell into the quiet of the March morning like the first note of a song, and Lucas felt it land somewhere in him that he would not have known to name. He held it carefully. He did not make a thing of it. "Can we come down?" Ellie asked. Her voice was small but certain. "Of course," he said. They came down the steps together, as they did everything, their shoulders nearly touching, and they stood on the lawn a few feet from where he was kneeling at the bed. And they looked at the roses. "Are those the ones?" Emma asked. "The ones from our dad?" Lucas looked at the center section. "Yes," he said. "Those are the ones." She was quiet for a moment, studying the swelling buds with a seriousness that made her look, for a moment, much older than 7. Then she said, "Will they be red?" He nodded. "Deep red. By June." She took this in. She looked at her sister, some communication passing between them in the private language of twins that Lucas had been watching for months and had never been able to fully translate. Then she looked back at the rose bed and she said something that he was not prepared for. She said, "He used to talk to them. Our dad. We used to watch from upstairs." Lucas's hand stilled on his notepad. "He talked to them in the morning," Ellie said quietly. "We could hear him through the window. We couldn't hear the words. just his voice. Lucas looked at the two of them, these small, serious girls standing in the March sunlight beside their father's roses, and he felt the full weight of the world they had been carrying. He did not look away from it. He did not try to reduce it. "I know," he said. "I can tell someone loved these roses very much. You can see it in them." Emma nodded. She reached out slowly and touched one of the swelling buds with one finger. Very gently, the way you touch something you are not sure is real. "Will you talk to them?" she asked. "Like he did?" Lucas looked at that small hand resting on the bud. "Yes," he said. "I already do." She took her hand back. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Good." And that was all. They stayed for a few more minutes watching him work, and then they went back inside. But at the top of the terrace steps, Emma turned and looked at him one more time. "Thank you," she said, "for taking care of them." He nodded once. "It's what I'm here for," he said. But they both knew by then that was not entirely true. The call came the following Thursday, at 8 in the evening, while Lucas was helping Sophie with a school project about weather patterns. His phone lit up with a number he recognized. He looked at it for a moment. Sophie looked up from her poster board and said, "Is that the estate?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You should answer it, Dad." He answered it. Victoria's voice was different on the phone. No assistant, no professional distance. Just her voice, slightly careful the way you are careful when you're doing something you haven't done before. She said, "I wanted to call and tell you what happened today. Emma asked me to play the piano with her. Not to teach her, just to sit beside her while she played. She said she wanted someone there." He said, "Did you?" She said, "I did." We sat there for almost an hour. She played what she knew, and I played what I remembered, and it wasn't. She stopped. It wasn't sad. It was the first time something like that hasn't been sad. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's everything," he said. She was quiet too. Then she said, "I know you're just the gardener." He waited. She said, "I know that's what this is. You work here and I live here and we leave each other notes and that's all it needs to be." "I know that," he said. "Victoria." She stopped. He said, "I'm not just the gardener. I haven't been just the gardener for a long time. And I think you know that." A long silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that has something in it. Then she said, "The girls want to know if Sophie can come on Saturday. They want to show her the crocuses." He looked at Sophie, who was watching him with round dark eyes and the expression of someone who already knows how this story ends. He said, "We'll be there." He hung up. Sophie went back to her poster board, very carefully drawing a cumulonimbus cloud. After a moment she said, without looking up, "Is she nice?" He thought about pre-dawn coffee in the frost. About terrace notes and 5 words read 3 times like a prayer. About a woman sitting on a floor with her back against a door frame. Landing. "Yes," he said. "She is." Sophie nodded. "Good," she said. "I knew she would be." Saturday arrived with the particular brightness of early March, the kind of day that carries its warmth, like a promise it intends to keep. Lucas parked in the drive and he and Sophie walked up to the front door together. And before he could knock, the door opened. Emma and Ellie were both there side by side in their coats. "Ready." "Come see," Emma said. She was talking to Sophie, but she looked at Lucas too, briefly, and in her look was something so direct and uncomplicated and trusting that he had to breathe through it. They went, all 4 of them walking down toward the crocus beds in the early spring light, Emma and Sophie slightly ahead, already talking, and Ellie moving to walk beside Lucas with the calm matter-of-factness of someone who has decided a thing. She slipped her hand into his. He looked down at her. She looked ahead at the crocuses as if this were the most natural thing. He closed his hand around hers, gently, precisely, the way you hold something you intend to keep safe. Victoria was standing on the terrace when they reached the beds. She watched them come, watched her daughters moving through the morning light with an ease she had not seen in 14 months. And when she met Lucas's eyes across the garden, she did not look away. He did not look away either. Sophie was already crouching at the crocus bed pointing at something, and Emma was crouching beside her, both of them intent and bright-faced in the March sun. And Ellie stood beside Lucas with her small hand in his, and for a moment nothing moved. Nothing. The four of them, standing in James's garden in the light of a morning that felt like the first morning of something. Victoria came down the terrace steps. She crossed the lawn and came to stand beside Lucas, and she looked at the crocus beds and at their daughters, and they were, in that moment, undeniably in some necessary and irreversible way, their daughters, and she reached out and took his hand. Not the hand Ellie was holding, the other one. Quietly. Simply. The way you reach for something you have been moving toward for a long time without quite knowing that's what you were doing. He held it. They stood together in the rose garden that James had planted in the March light, with Sophie explaining to Emma with complete authority the scientific process by which a crocus bulb knew when to bloom. It had to do with soil temperature, she said, and trust and knowing the right time, and Ellie leaning slightly against Lucas's side, and the whole east bed alive with the first real color of spring. The roses were still weeks from blooming, but they were coming. You could see it in every cane, in every swelling bud, in the deep red color just beginning to show beneath the outer skin of the wood, that particular urgency of things that have waited long enough and know, now that the season has arrived. Spring always comes, Lucas had written months ago, on a scrap of paper left on a terrace table in November. He had been right. He had been right about all of it. Above them, in the window of the music room, the piano sat open for the first time in a year and a half. Its keys pale in the morning light, waiting. Everything was waiting. And everything at last was ready.